Hi, welcome back. It is Bonded Book Club discussion day, so if you're just joining us, we read Pushout by Dr. Monique Morris this month. I love a hardcover book, but I always lose the sleeve. So it has a picture of a girl on the front. Mine does this. Brittany can show you what the real one is. You can also check it out on the website. So Brittany got us started today, gave us a little bit of a synopsis, started to jump into the subject matter, but I wanted to take a moment before I get started and note that this is one of those topics where there's going to seem like there's a lot of overlap. And the reason for that is that none of these issues can be looked at in isolation or within a vacuum. There are so many interrelated components to what is happening. It's a true crisis for young Black girls in this country in school, and to be able to fully discuss the issue, you're going to notice lots of overlap and lots of interplay based on the different kind of areas that we discussed today and throughout the book. There are definitely, themes and patterns that show up over and over again. So that is something that you'll notice while we're talking, but it's important. None of these things can be, quite honestly, talked about enough. So if you see some overlap or any of that, that's why. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My first question is, explain the dangers of allowing for punishment based on willful defiance. So one of the biggest problems with willful defiance is that it doesn't actually have a clear definition. And while allowing punishment to be based on something that is not easily defined puts it into sort of this catch-all category. And if you look on page 70, Morris writes, "Willful defiance has become a routine way by which to punish and marginalize Black girls in learning spaces when they directly confront adults or indirectly complicate the teacher's ability to manage the classroom. It is not necessarily actions that pose a threat to the physical safety of anyone on campus." So to be able to talk about willful defiance and why it is so dangerous as a way to inflict punishment upon these girls, you have to understand something that Brittany talked about, which is this stereotype of the Black girl attitude, which is that they're sassy or they're loud or there's a whole list of what do you imagine the sort of Black girl attitude. And rather than taking a different cultural approach to understanding these girls, we're able to just label them as disrespectful, insubordinate, defiant, and the schools are using this as a way to push them out, whether it's into the hallway, get out of here, get out of my classroom, suspension, or expulsion. And it makes it clear both to the girls that there is no real order. They feel like they can't win, that this is something, I was just asking a question, but she thought I had an attitude, this teacher, or whatever it may be. And it ends up taking things that may have been able to be handled internally within the school and instead pushing these girls out of the education system, denying them their education. And there are all of these different techniques that are out there that are being talked about, and it's, there is this understanding that teachers need more resources, whether that's training, simply just more of them. This stuff can become quite overwhelming for teachers. This is not to give them any excuses, but to understand when you have 30 some odd students in your class, their teachers are human too. So when we remove the idea of willful defiance, we can more clearly define what are boundaries, giving students real boundaries, not removing children who are at the core of all of this, children from schools for willful defiance, for questioning authority, or acting out and generally being a nuisance. This idea, and the more studies that come out all the time, that by removing bad kids, good kids can learn, is absolute garbage, and it's not true. And so when we find other ways to interact with students and handle conflict, we can lower suspension rates, expulsion rates, and actually improve the overall learning environment in classrooms. So that's the first one. Why is willful defiance a dangerous basis for punishment. Oh, okay. So the second question we have here is, why is it important to emphasize not just an education, but a quality education? What are the implications if we choose to ignore the ineptitudes in the education system, especially for the most vulnerable youth? There's this idea, and all the girls in this book can, talk about this, most students that you encounter, that an education is important, that if you want to have a good life, you need to get an education. But we've failed to fully define what that actually means. I read an article yesterday in the Washington Post about a high school that has had over 25% of their teachers leave mid-year. Over 25%. That is a huge amount of the teaching faculty gone. One of the students they interviewed, he was in 11th grade, I think, he said it'd been months since anyone was actually teaching in his classroom. It's a constant flow of subs, sometimes long-term, not necessarily qualified to be teaching in the subjects that they're put into. And the students aren't stupid. They understand. When you are not providing a real learning environment, there is a sense of disillusionment, that we are not adequately preparing students for what comes next, for adulthood, to thrive. What happens when you allow students to go from one grade to the next without actually being concerned with whether or not they've learned what they need to? You end up with students in high school that still can't read. And that is not the same thing as a quality education. Technically, being in the building every day within those walls is an education of sorts, but they're just as aware as any of you listening to this that is not actually a quality education. That is not preparing them for life. And so unless we recognize that it's not simply enough to have schools or have people in schools, but to have well-funded schools, to have the resources for the teachers to be giving the students what they need to succeed, and understanding that that is not the same in every school, that is not the same for every student, is going to be a huge portion of how we can shift the paradigm in the system that so many of these girls are getting stuck in. And so I think if you look on page 31, and Monique Morris writes, however, not every type of education opens up that pathway out of poverty, and the quality of education has everything to do with being prepared to thrive as an adult. School resources, quality of teaching, curriculum, relationships with the parents, the community network, all of those elements go to support a quality education. It requires so many components to be operating in unison and committed to these students, to give them the kind of education that actually gives them a chance for their future. And this is one of those situations where, I urge all of you that read the book or are sitting here and coming from a place of privilege to try to resist the urge to say, well, my education or my high school or the way it was for me, this seems outrageous. That's not really, it can't be that bad, because it is. And oftentimes the people with the privilege, the people who did not experience the kind of actual just ineptitude from a lot of these schools are those that are going to have the most power and the most ability to affect change. So it's opening ourselves up to this idea that there is such a lack in so many places, so that we can begin to change it overall on a systemic level. The hard part about that is that there's not an easy fix. It's not an easy answer. Money helps. Resources help. There's very few things that money can't help. Money alone is not enough. But these are not easy answers. And we have to be committed to finding the right answer, even if it's harder. 3, explain why exclusionary discipline is particularly harmful. What are examples of exclusionary discipline? Yeah, I'm gonna grab a quick drink. Okay. So exclusionary discipline could be everything from you're misbehaving, go in the hall. Kick a student out of class, send them out of your sight, they're in the hall. To suspension, whether that's in school or out of school, to expulsion. Obviously, the range of consequences varies as well. From the most basic standpoint, by using exclusion as a primary form of discipline, you are denying students their education. You are also sending the students the message that they are not important enough, that they do not deserve this education, that you don't care. And that becomes an ingrained part of who they are and what they think is expected of them. There also becomes these hurdles when you've missed so much material. You become so far behind in class that getting over that can seem insurmountable. And then you are, what's the point? I'm never going to get it. I'm so far behind, I can't possibly do it. Why am I even here? It is a sentiment that you see throughout the book and these girls talking. They know that. They are not unaware. These girls are just stunningly aware of the way they're being treated and the circumstances that they're facing. So on one level, you have this problem, this idea that they're not getting the education. They're not able to learn. They're not in an environment where they're able to progress along with the rest of their classmates. The other problem, when you have especially instances of exclusion that push them out of the school entirely, they're not necessarily, so if someone is expelled from school, there is not necessarily an alternative that is reasonably available to them, which leaves them with nothing. You also are doing this to girls who are some of the most vulnerable. It opens them up to issues of sex trafficking. It makes them more vulnerable to, issues with gangs and drugs. When you push them out, you are increasing the level of vulnerability and the horrible things that some of these girls are facing. Some of them are already involved or taken into human trafficking while they're in school, and to push them out, you have taken away their ability to have access to anyone who might be able to help them. It is definitely saying that we are more interested in discipline than we are in focusing on the individual. And so it is just something that's going to take a larger shift, to be looking at these things not just as in, I can't deal with this. Again, resources help, but they're not everything. So it's going to be both a mentality shift, but also giving administrators, schools, teachers other ways to handle situations that don't need to escalate to this level. Brittany talked about school resource officers and the way that they can often escalate situations, can lead to more extreme instances of exclusionary discipline. It puts girls in more apt to enter into this criminal justice system at a younger age, to encounter that, to be put into that system. And that is not the answer. It is something that we need to be avoiding. So my last question for this video is, what role does gender play in the challenges that Black girls face in school? And I think the first thing to note is the idea that you cannot separate your identity. So a Black girl is not just dealing with the systems or the oppressions that come from the result of being a girl. She is also Black, and it is impossible to expect her to, or to want her to be able to separate her own identity. You cannot take away your womanness or your Blackness. And so for these girls, that is one of these challenges and these hurdles that become so complicated for them. As a Black girl, there are these caricatures of Black femininity that have been perpetuated from, stemming from our history of slavery. This idea that Black women are hypersexualized, they're of loose morals, they're loud, they're aggressive, They're this sort of like sassy mentality. And we think of that for Black women, but due to issues of age compression, which is to say that we attribute adult characteristics to Black girls. We see them as older than they are. They may be 12 years old, but we treat them and see them as adults. And so we transfer these sort of stereotypes and characterizations of them onto these children. You know, if there's one thing I had to remind myself through this entire book and urge everyone to continue to like say out loud is that these are kids. What does a 12-year-old look like? What is that like? These are children. These are not adults. And I think that so often you have, so for Black girls, this layer of their gender on top of their Blackness complicates it. You know, I think there's going to be some more talk in one of our later videos on dress code and sexualization of these young girls, and how for Black girls that plays out quite differently than it would for white girls, and what role that plays. You know, we also have the problem that when we talk about our like gender justice movements, for that we tend to want to make it colorblind, and we talk about things that would affect all women. The problem with that, though, is that all women are not affected the same. And so unless we take an intersectional approach to looking at gender, we're not going to be adequately serving these girls. We're not going to be addressing the issues that they're facing. On the racial justice side, often girls are forgotten, and the resources and the focus so often is put onto Black boys or Black men. Which leaves Black girls in particular in this vacuum. They are forgotten and left out by just about everybody without taking into account their whole identity, which makes intersectionality just so much at the crux of how we can address the problems that Black girls are facing. So that is my last question for today, or for this video. I'll be back around 3. I don't know what time. I'll be back at 3. Brittany's going to be back at 2. We've got more questions for you. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you've read the book, leave them in the comments. If you haven't read the book and this is something you're interested in, join in on the discussion. You know, we like to hear from all of you, and we will keep going. Hope you guys are all having a great day. Bye.